Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Naomi Walker, and I'm the director of EARN, the Economic Analysis and Research Network at EPI. EARN is made up of 55 state policy, research, and advocacy groups around the country focused on winning worker, gender, and racial justice. EPI is incredibly proud to be co-hosting this discussion with the Insight Center and WISER, the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race, particularly in this moment. And because we have so much to talk about, we've extended the time of this webinar until 2:30 p.m. to allow for more time for this critical and timely discussion. And we hope that you will be able to stick around with us because it is going to be a really tremendous conversation. Many of us on the call today come to the discussion with both a heavy spirit and righteous indignation about the structural racism woven into the systems and policies of our country. From the treatment of essential workers, the majority of whom are Black and brown, to the woman in Central Park who used the power of her whiteness to threaten the existence of a Black bird watcher, to the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, to the chilling calm exhibited by the Minneapolis police officer who extinguished George Floyd's life, and all who've come before. Black people in this country face physical and economic violence every day. And all of this is taking place in the midst of a stunning, though not surprising, lack of leadership from the highest office in the land. And so we'd like to take a moment of silence to offer those who've lost their lives to racism. If you'll join me. Thank you. This afternoon, we have the opportunity to engage on some of these issues with an amazing group of talented, brilliant women of color. Far too often, the voices and opinions of Black and brown women are left out of national economic debates and policymaking, and we want to elevate those voices here today. So we're going to hear from Valerie Wilson from the Economic Policy Institute, Jhumpa Bhattacharya from the Insight Center, along with Ann Price, who's also at the Insight Center, Rhonda Sharp from WISER, which again is the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race, Jaribu Hill from Mississippi Worker Center for Human Rights, and Julianne Malveaux from Economic Education, and she's also an Economic Policy Institute board member. And I'm really pleased to be on this call today with these powerful women. And so on today's call, we're first going to hear from Valerie Wilson about the new report we released today entitled Black Workers Face the Two Most Lethal Pre-Existing Conditions for Coronavirus, Racism, and Economic Inequality. And then after that, we're going to have a chance to hear reactions from our panelists and dig into a discussion of the anti-Blackness that is the bedrock of our country and its systems. And so now I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Valerie Wilson.
Thank you, Naomi. And I want to thank Rhonda Sharp for really birthing this idea and bringing it to all of us, inviting us to share our voices with each of you today. And to the other speakers, Ann, Jhumpa, Jaribu, Julianne, and Naomi, I am so grateful to all of you for being such willing partners in bringing this conversation to the fore. I also would like to thank my co-author on the report, Elise Gould, and our research assistant, Daniel Perez, for their assistance in pulling together this information I'm going to share with you briefly this morning. And then I also want to thank the entire EPI Communications Department that has been absolutely wonderful in helping to get the report done with editing, preparing graphics for sharing on social media, the webinar logistics, the media outreach, and really doing a lot to help promote the webinar and the report. And so I welcome all who are watching, and we look forward to the conversation later in a few moments. But before we get started, I do want to highlight a few points from the report that we released today, entitled Black Workers Face Two of the Most Lethal Pre-Existing Conditions for Coronavirus, Racism, and Economic Inequality. The way that we have summarized our findings is that there are three main groups of workers in the COVID-19 economy. One, if we could go to the next slide, one being those who have lost their jobs and face tremendous economic insecurity. And as you all know, based on the last report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, job losses were widespread. There are millions of people out of work now. The unemployment rate nationally has risen to levels that we probably have never seen, or if we've seen it all, we haven't seen them since the Great Depression. But for African American workers who in normal times, whether we're in an economic expansion or a recession, typically have double the rate of unemployment as white Americans, African Americans continue to have the highest unemployment rates in the COVID economy as well. The second group of workers, and if we could go to the next slide, the second group of workers are those who have been classified as essential workers. And by virtue of that fact, these essential workers face greater health insecurity because they're having to go to work each and every day, exposing themselves to coronavirus. While African Americans are just under 12% of all workers, they are disproportionately represented among these frontline workers, being about 17%. And that's true across a number of different industries, including grocery workers, our transit workers, postal workers, others who work in delivery services, as well as healthcare and other kinds of social assistance jobs. Next slide, please. Now, the third group of workers that we've seen in the COVID economy are those who are able to continue to work safely from their homes. And in fact, Black workers are the least likely to be in this group. As you can see in this chart, Black workers are less likely to be able to work from home, and in fact, are less likely as well to have access to paid sick leave. And so when we consider what we're seeing in this immediate situation where coronavirus has hit, it's a once in most of our lifetimes experience, widespread economic impact and tremendous health consequences. But what we know for those of us who have been doing this work a long time is that this really is not anything that is shocking or surprising, because we know that we've seen throughout history the underlying economic disparities that we see in this society are simply being magnified by coronavirus. So next slide, please. This shows the distribution of deaths from coronavirus. And in fact, what we see here is that the majority of folks who, the African Americans are disproportionately represented among those who have died from coronavirus, and disproportionately being a function of the share of people dying from coronavirus is actually greater than the share the African Americans represent in the overall population. CDC also, these are data from the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. CDC also report a weighted population distribution that accounts for areas where there are more outbreaks of coronavirus. And even when they adjust the numbers to account for the fact that coronavirus isn't showing up equally in all places, we actually see that African Americans are a larger share of the population in places where we've seen outbreaks than they are in the population as a whole. Next slide, please. So one of the things that, again, when we go back to look at the economic impact and particularly look at the job impact, we find that rates of unemployment, again, when we consider even before coronavirus, this data is from 2019, last year, even when we consider that, we find that at every level of education, the Black unemployment rate is higher than the white unemployment rate, and often many times higher, many multiples higher. For those who have less than a high school diploma, we actually typically will find an unemployment rate that is more than double the white unemployment rate. Next slide, please. Just a second, I'm trying to get my screen where I can see things larger. This next slide shows wage disparities. And in particular, we see that sorry, I'm still trying to get this to a little larger here. We see that the Black-white wage gap is large and persistent across a number of different measures. That's true overall. The average Black worker earns about 73% of what the average white worker earns. We see that that's true across genders. Black men and Black women earn less than their white counterparts. That's true across the wage distribution, regardless of if you're at the lower end, the 10th percentile, at the median, or among the highest earners. And it's true at every level of education as well. Next slide, please. The result of these higher rates of unemployment and these persistent wage gaps have consequences not just for the individual worker. And I think that's something important to understand in this context, specifically when we're talking about a simultaneous public health crisis at the same time that we're having an economic crisis. Because workers live in households, they live with families, they are members of their community. And so when we have these underlying disparities in unemployment, underlying disparities in wages, that translates into these disparate levels of household income as well as disparate rates of poverty. For as long as I've been doing this kind of work, I can tell you that the ratio between the median Black household income and the median white household income has always been about 60%. 58 to 60 is pretty much the norm, at least for the last 50 years. And again, that goes back to these disparities in employment opportunities and disparities in pay. That difference in median household income translates into disparate rates of poverty as well. Next slide, please. I think another thing that is important to understand in this, beyond these disparities in income, because income is really a measure of how much money you're able to earn for most of us through employment, bringing in on a regular basis. But there's also a greater and I think more important measure of economic vulnerability that we often miss when we only focus on wage or income. And that is the racial wealth gap, disparities in wealth that provide a level of economic security, provide cushion to folks when we experience downturns or shocks like we're experiencing now. And so this shows that Black families have significantly less cash reserves to draw upon in these difficult times than do white families. That's true overall. We're looking here at a difference between $8,000, a little over $8,000 in cash reserves for Black families compared to nearly $50,000 in cash reserves for white families. It's also true across different levels of education, whether or not you're a homeowner, and across different industries of employment as well. So again, the wealth gap is persistent, it's long-standing, and in these times when people are without employment for various reasons, whether they lost their job or in the interest of their own health and safety, they've had to step back from work. These differences in wealth really are significant when it comes to whether or not a family is able to maintain their standard of living. Next slide, please. Again, moving from issues related to an individual worker to looking at how it impacts a household and a family and a community. When we look at Black households relative to white households, Black households are less likely to have multiple earners. And I make this point because I like to make the additional point that this isn't just a function of the number of people in the household. It's not just a matter of family structure. These disparities in the number of earners in a household are themselves a reflection of that persistent 2-to-1 Black-white unemployment disparity. So even when you have a household where there are 2 adults, because there's such a persistent disparity in employment, you're more likely to see a Black household having just 1 earner in the instance that someone, at least one of those people are employed, as opposed to 2 or more earners. Next slide, please. And then I use this just to make a point and to draw out specifically for Black women, a challenge that we're seeing during the coronavirus. So this chart shows different family types among households. These are focused specifically on people who are members of families. Families are identified as those who are living with someone related to them by blood or through marriage or adoption. Black women in particular are more likely to have to juggle the dual challenge of work. If you have an opportunity to have your job, if you're one of these frontline essential workers, for example, and you have a child, more likely to have to juggle those competing responsibilities of having to work, provide for your family financially, protect your health and the health of those in your household, as well as need to address issues related to childcare, or as many of us are doing now, teaching or homeschooling your children at home. So I included this slide because we want to draw out all of the different ways that this crisis looks differently for different people depending on your race, ethnicity, and or your gender. Next slide, please. Another thing that I think is important when we consider how being an essential worker interacts and overlaps with other features of a household is to consider the kinds of structures that people live in this country, and how that also is disparate or divided based on race or ethnicity. African Americans are less likely to live in single unit, detached or attached dwellings or physical structures, and more likely to live in multi-unit housing where there are more people living in a more densely populated area, more people living in buildings where there may be common areas that are highly trafficked and have greater opportunity or greater likelihood of coming in contact or interacting with other people. Another way that the virus is contracted as people find it more difficult to exercise social distancing if you're living in a more densely populated building or area of the city. Next slide, please. And then another dynamic that comes into play when we consider Black households, and we consider the number of generations who live in a household. Again, going back to this issue of being an essential worker, on one hand, that provides some degree of job security because you still have a job. But at the same time, if you live in one of these multi-generational households, for example, a household with 3 or more generations may include an adult working parent who also lives with their parent and their child. So you have a grandparent, a parent, and a grandchild living in the same household. Again, those who are essential and having to go out every day into the public and interact with others, putting themselves at greater risk for contracting coronavirus and experiencing greater exposure, but also then coming to have to live in a household with others who then are exposed and become at risk as well. Next slide. And one of the final points I want to draw out, we've heard a lot and there's been a lot of focus and attention on the small business community and making sure that they get the resources and assistance that they need. One of the things that I think is very interesting about this, we know that overall, on average, Black-owned businesses are a very small share of the total number of businesses in this country, just under 10%. But when we consider their share of different industries, and particularly those industries that are most vulnerable during coronavirus, they're overrepresented in those industries that are most likely to be impacted. And the significance of this is that we've already heard multiple accounts of Black-owned businesses who were having difficulty accessing the funding that was made available through the Paycheck Protection Program. Um, and so this is yet another layer of that inequality that we see playing out, even in an instance where there was a huge, a widespread kind of reaction and response that was totally appropriate and accurate. But because of disparities in the economic and social position of people in this country based on race, we still see very disparate outcomes, even for very widespread actions to counteract the negative effects. Another example I'd like to raise that we mentioned in the paper has to do with the issue of the stimulus checks or the coronavirus checks that went out to provide families with some additional support during this time. But because we know that, again, African American households are more likely to be unbanked, those who did not have a bank account faced challenges with being able to get that money quickly. That was delayed. If you didn't have a bank account, there had to be some other way of getting that money to you. The other solution to coronavirus was to shut everything down, to go to remote schooling or remote work if that was an option for you. But again, we have a digital divide in this country whereby Black households are less likely to have computers or to have access to the internet, that all but make that impossible to engage in online learning or able to work remotely. So there were a number of things that we pulled out in this report, and I encourage you to go and read it and to pull from those statistics. I just highlighted a few of those points here with the interest of trying to paint a picture of why we're seeing the results that we're seeing and why that really shouldn't be much of a surprise to us, given the underlining health and economic disparities that have been a part of this country for throughout its history.
Great, thank you so much, Valerie. Now I would like to open it up to our amazing panel of women to give some reactions to some of the numbers and ideas that Valerie shared in her presentation about the report. Some of those numbers were astonishing. And I think in the context of your responses, if you could also lift up why it is that that we are, to talk a little bit about what anti-Blackness is and why it's so important to focus on Black people. Why is it important to focus on Black people and Black women in particular when you're talking about the economic impact and health impacts of what is happening now with both the pandemic and the economic crisis. So I'll open it up to our panel.
Okay, I'll go.
Julianne, thank you.
Let me say a couple of things. First of all, I think we're all totally decimated by the death of George Floyd and the visual of a murderer with his knee on his neck. It's not just because of that particular case, but it's because of the many cases that we have absorbed. These are body blows. I also think that, white folks need to check their language. I was watching the Today Show this morning and Savannah Guthrie said, oh, we want to look at the Minneapolis incident. No, it was not an incident, girlfriend. It was a murder. And that's what we have to deal with. But these murders are consistent with murders that have happened as long as we've been here in this country. We don't have to go to 2020. We can start at 1892 when Ida B. Wells documented the lynching of her friend who had the nerve to start a grocery store on the same block that a white man had one. The long end of that short story was the white man was able to acquire the black man's store for 8 cents on the dollar. For 8 cents on the dollar. And we can talk about Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, when the anecdotal evidence was that the river ran red. They said there were 60 or 70 dead people. Now they're finding 600 or 700. And then of course there's Tulsa. And why is this all connected? It's connected because in our psyches, there is a block in terms of how we participate, how we manage, what we do. And so the data that Valerie shared is really wonderful, and I'm grateful to her for making sure that we see the disparities, but it's also important to note that these disparities are not new, that these things have happened over the years, and frankly, because organizations like EPI and others have the opportunity to really chop this data up, we're seeing what the inequities, inequities are. So I think that what is one of the things that needs to happen is that we don't need to simply talk about inequities, but we also need to talk about solutions. And one of the, we need to talk about targeting. You know, we know that there's a disparity. So why we target wealth building solutions for Black people? We know that there are gaps that are a function of predatory capitalism. So why can't we address those? Now, you know, that's likely not to happen, but we have to put it out there. So as you know, I'm a member of the board of EPI, but I'm also a member of NARC, which is the National African Americans Reparations Committee. And we want to keep talking about reparations because this is important. We will not the wealth gap until we deal with the nature of predatory capitalism. And the data that Valerie shared is the clear outcome of predatory capitalism, of how you end up with those numbers. So I'll stop there. I'll jump in another time, but that's all I have to say.
Thanks, Julianne. Jaribu, did you want to get in there?
Yeah, I'm boiling over, actually. Just is so good to hear my sister again, always clear, always right to the point, and language is important. Over the last few days, we have heard some outlandish descriptions of what's happening to our people, from, oh, senseless rioting, destroying things, but no one talked about the lynching by the knee. No one talked about how, with impunity, agents of the state who hide behind 10 badges always get away with murdering Black people. And you add that to, you match that up with those who are dying in COVID beds disproportionately to those who have been dying in the streets since we were dragged over here as a result of a felony kidnapping. And it just makes you know that you got to keep your rage. You got to keep your rage. You can never let your rage down. I don't even say guard down. I say never let your rage down. So we're working in the area of workers' rights. And I applaud the organizers of this webinar, and thank you so much for inviting me to join to talk about the fate of the suffering mass, which is the Black working class, to talk about how we suffer in these jobs, these Jim Crow jobs where we are assigned to the dirtiest and the most dangerous jobs. And that was before COVID and now. And I share one quick horrific story. We were on a conference call because people don't have Zoom. So we resorted to a workers' rights conference call with some folks who work in a laundry factory here in Greenville, Mississippi, and they recounted how it was flooded. And in the flooding, they were not allowed to go home or leave the plant floor. They were forced to put plastic bags over their feet and stand in flooded water and fold linens coming in from the hospitals. They were unmasked, they were ungloved and unprotected. And this is over and over again, this is what we're seeing. I will stop there because the Baptist preacher could run away with it, but I know there are other voices that are just as important. So I'm going to stop there before I explode.
Thank you so much, Jaribu.
Well,
And
Explode, girl, explode. Not now, when?
We need to explode.
you know, what we're really talking about is the devaluation and disposability of Black lives.
That's right.
And that's what brings these all together, the convergence of police brutality, of policing Black bodies, and the negligence that we've seen in terms of COVID and Black people. And let's talk about Black women. You know, just listening to Jaribu talk about what's happening in Mississippi. When we look at who's really locked out of job opportunities in Mississippi, it is Black women, that they are excluded from 62% of jobs in Mississippi. So we have to look at these converging factors and the fact that there's an invisibility about police brutality in Black women. I mean, certainly we're seeing that with Breonna Taylor, more recently and others, but oftentimes we don't think about this in regards to Black women. What we're really seeing is people fighting back on what they're experiencing, which is state-sponsored violence. So when we hear the rhetoric in the media, let's really talk about what violence exists in this country. And poverty itself is violence, right? Mass incarceration is violence.
That's right.
So it's very interesting that when we talk about people going into a Target, we don't talk at the same time about the violence that's been perpetuated against Black communities and Black women specifically.
thank you so much, Anne.
So I want to piggyback on both the comments about why we focus on Black women. One of the things that we don't necessarily see in the full report that Valerie and Elise provide is disaggregation of data by women, for women, you know, so looking at Black and separating that by Black men, Black women, and then also thinking about this more in depth in terms of family structure. Black men and Black women are generally not employed in the same types of occupations. Household structures may look very different. And as we're having this conversation about essential workers, I was speaking to someone on Saturday and brought up, you know, this idea of essential workers and not having the proper protective equipment to go to work, personal protective equipment. And the person said to me, we're thinking about this wrong. These are not essential workers, they're essential jobs. The workers are expendable, and that we know that they are expendable because we're not providing them with the PPE in order to protect themselves. So as we're thinking about these expendable workers and these essential jobs, and you take a step back, you even have to be careful in that, because if we're talking essential jobs and doctors and nurses, that may look very different than when we're talking about essential workers or essential jobs when we're talking about care and aid. So it can be the same healthcare industry, but when you look at healthcare aides, that's going to be majority women of color, right? That's not going to be white women. Nurses are going to be white women. So when we're talking about policies and why we're focusing on Black women, it is, you know, one of the things that I felt really horrible about when I was doing my dissertation and disaggregating data even back then, and not even thinking about it by race and gender, is Black women are inevitably always at the bottom. Right? It doesn't really matter what the stats is that we're looking at, especially when we're talking about economics and well-being, we're at the bottom. We have a wiser dialogue with Rebecca Dixon and Kimmy Roll of National Employment Law Project, and they make this very clear. When you center on Black women, the most vulnerable, and you create policies that are focused on the most vulnerable, i.e. Black women, then you will get policies that lift everyone, right? John Kennedy said it eons ago, you know, the tide does not lift all boats. And it's a title that people consistently use and consistently would tell you it's false. But if you're lifting the boat that Black women are in, then you actually will have policies that will lift everyone. So that's one of the reasons why we're here, and we're focused on Black women, and the anti-Blackness around Black women often focuses on them being mothers. Right. So my former colleague, Nina Bank, talks about white women are considered mothers. Black women are always considered workers. right? And there's a devaluing in the care in which Black women provide. So that's why we're focusing on Black women.
And that's a really graphic.
Rhonda, one of the things that's really interesting is the fact that so many African
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
so many African American women are CNAs, certified nursing assistants. 22% of those women, we're 13% of the population, but 22% of those women are African American. When we talk about, social distancing, careful, these people can't do that. They have to go to work. The numbers are almost equally high for Latina women, 21%, I think. These are the people who are holding it up with a minuscule representation in population. So one of the things we have to look at is when people talk about essential workers, they're not talking about essential support. And that essential support throughout our history has been African American women. White women couldn't have babies if it were not for Black women.
Ouch.
Who were the nurses, who were the housekeepers, who all of that. But in this essential time, what we're seeing is both the critical nature of Black women's work, but also the ways that we have devalued it. And the devaluation is part of what we need to deal with and address. We need these women who are leaving their families and going into somebody's hospital to get hazard pay. We need these women to be supported. We need to make sure they all have PPEs. This is not happening because we've been thingified. We've been considered peripheral.
Yes, I am killing myself over here. And Julianne, you mentioned a while back about someone mentioned the importance of unions. And I just want to draw us to a stark reality in terms of suffering workers. Most workers, as you know, do not belong to unions. They have never been organized. The South in particular, you look at the overall picture is around 12.5% of all workers have unions in this country. In Mississippi, it's 4.2%. In North Carolina, 2.1%. South Carolina, 1.3%. Of workers who have unions. So there is no protection and there's no expectation in terms of job security. A lot of workers in these big box companies actually are classified as temporary workers. And many of them are Black women who work for agencies, who are farmed out from agencies to work at places like Walmart. And so you get someone coming right out of prison to start a new life. And they tell you, oh, I just got my first job since I was incarcerated for 16 years. And I work at Walmart. And I'm cringing saying, oh, Walmart, oh my God. But I cringe further when she says that it's a temporary job. She has no status, no benefits. And so the temporary work system, I'm gonna blame it squarely on organized labor because it has not been taken up. It has not been addressed that this is the height of worker exploitation. We need to do more. And we also need to talk about other forms of representation, including third parties, perhaps in the richest country in the world. Maybe we need to talk about a labor party. And I want to underscore, as I always do, this is Jaribu from the Mississippi Workers Center talking now. I'm not trying to assign this to anyone, but there needs to be conversations about why the majority of people in this country are not protected by anybody. And so the lockout, the retaliation the workers are experiencing. Now we have a woman we're representing who was fired when she self-quarantined after being exposed to COVID by her husband, who subsequently died. So while in mourning her husband, she was fired from her damn job. No benefits, let go. And her supervisor told her as she was leaving, I love you, but she was terminated. So I'm just saying this is happening over and over again. No protection at all for workers at all. No expectation that you're not going to be retaliated against. No expectation that you're going to have a real status on the job. And there are big box companies who shamefully use the temporary system as their primary workforce. Don't make me call them all out because this is not my webinar.
Jaribu, thank you so much. And I think the point that you raised about workers urgently and desperately need to have a voice on the job, and that we, in the absence of courageous policymakers who take on wide-scale reforms, having some of that workplace democracy will really help in this moment. I want to give some space to Jhumpa to jump in to the conversation. I know she has some thoughts about how other women of color can weigh in on this conversation about anti-Blackness and supporting Black women.
Yeah, thanks, Naomi. I want to acknowledge that I am the only non-Black person on this call, and want to give space to Black women in particular to speak. So, but I do think it's important to bring in the perspective as a South Asian woman, why other women of color in particular need to be thinking about and addressing anti-Blackness, right? So there's a couple of points that I think I want to raise. Not I think, I know that I want to raise. So the first one being, I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that anti-Blackness is a thread that goes through all communities, right? So anti-Blackness exists in Latinx communities, it exists in Asian communities, it exists in Native communities, it exists very specifically in South Asian communities, and I can speak from that perspective. You know, if you just look at South Asian beauty standards, right? For me as a little girl being told so often over and over again, the darker you are, the less attractive you are, right? Like our beauty standards are so aligned to whiteness, right? So that is a specific way in which anti-Blackness plays out in the South Asian community. And one that I think really needs to be addressed and named. And we often think about racism as a whole. And yes, racism impacts all communities of color, obviously. But there is something very specific about anti-Blackness, and there's something very definitive about anti-Blackness that I think needs to be named. And we're seeing that now, right? In particular with what's happening in our country. And I think as women of color, if we don't acknowledge the specificity of anti-Blackness, we're actually doing a disservice, and we're contributing to it, right? So one is to really pause and examine the way in which our own communities are perpetuating anti-Blackness. The second thing is, you know, Anne and I talk about anti-Blackness a lot. We talk about one specific way to address anti-Blackness is to center Black people, right, in our policies, in our institutions, in our decision-making. To bring in points that have already been made, when we center Black women, we lift up everybody, right? And I think one response that I get a lot is, well, when we're talking about centering Blackness or we're talking about anti-Blackness, what about me, right, as a non-Black person? What does that mean for me? And I guess what I want to say is that centering Blackness is not to the exclusion of all other communities. It's actually a very much an inclusive way to talk about everyone, right? Because I do believe that when we center Black women, yes, everyone will be raised. And my liberation as a South Asian woman is completely intertwined with yours. I will never be free unless all these women here on this panel right now are also free. Right? And so working towards centering Blackness is working towards your liberation and my liberation together. And I think that's a point that doesn't get said enough. And we often get torn in the like, well, what about me? You're not talking about me. And I think that's a tool of white supremacy as well, right? To pit ourselves against one another, to play the oppression Olympics. But it's different. What is happening to Black people in America is different. It's unique. It's specific. And we have to lift that up and name it. And it doesn't mean that's what's happening to my community doesn't matter. Of course it matters, but it's all related. And I think the root cause of this is anti-Blackness. And if we're not willing to stand up and name that, then we're doing a disservice.
So Naomi, I want to jump in real quick and say,
Rhonda.
in thinking about putting folks together, because the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race is generally, we don't use the term women of color, we're about Asian, Black, Hispanic, Native American women. So I was like, yeah, Jhumpa, like, I'm gonna want you to talk about Asian women. She was like, nope, we are talking about anti-Blackness. And I thought, wow, I can't even get the Asian woman to even want to talk about Asian women. She's like anti-Blackness. And I want to chime in and say that what she just said to the audience as a whole is also what she said to me in our one-on-one conversation, which, you know, is what I'm consistently hearing. I think Valerie, and I'm gonna speak for Valerie just a little bit, I think Valerie and I tend to be more in data, right? We're looking at data, and I'm gonna take the liberty of sort of transitioning us to talk about data in a time when the census is out, how important it is for people to filled out the census. I understand the census also has this thing called Pulse, in which they've been collecting information bi-weekly. You know, as folks who are deep in data, Valerie and I really need you all to fill out those forms, to give that information so that we can produce reports that look like the one she just presented. And then we can have conversations where people like Jaribru and Anne and Jumpa and Julianne can help us figure out the narratives, so that when you need to go and testify in front of the Senate and the Congress about why changes need to be made, we get hard numbers and narratives that come along with that. And we can't do that if people aren't filling out these forms when they come around, and you're filling them out to the, the best of your ability and as honest as possible. We can't get at these inequalities without that data.
And I just want to support what Rhonda said, and also add, though, that what was appalling to me at the time when they started to supposedly lift up Blackness, which has never been lifted up in this country, make no mistake about it. But when they started throwing charts up, even on CNN, about the disproportionality of Black suffering during COVID, one of our elected officials, who shall remain nameless, said, "Oh, now that the data is out, we really need to address it." And I want to say, look, and I'm not going to say what I said, you know doggone well this has always been there, and you haven't dealt with it. Now you're shocked at these statistics. How many numbers do people need to see in order to know that this is a reality? So what gets me is how people try to blame the fact that they don't have the most recent numbers, but yet the problem has never changed. The problem has always been severe. And finally, I just want to lift up the notion of rebellion, the notion of resistance, because I think there is some value judgment placed on that. And I want to say that I've been posting on Facebook, as many of us have, and on Twitter, and I've been talking about the righteous responses that come in the form of rebellion. And so over the last several days, we have witnessed targeting, and some people will say anarchy, some people will say, why are they burning down their own homes? They're not just doing that. They're breaking out the windows of banking institutions that represent Black repression. They're breaking out the windows of insurance companies that used to insure Black bodies. So I'm just saying, let's look at rebellion as a historic feature in terms of resistance, in terms of our movements, and let's lift up people who dare to take to the streets instead of vilifying them and judging them and saying, oh, we don't need that, we don't need that. And they can always grab some folks to get in front of the camera and all forms of resistance. So that's a problem. And I just wanted to lift that up because we talked about this moment that we're in.
Great, thank you so much.
What happens to a dream deferred? Does it rise up like a raisin in the sun? Does it shrivel and then run? Maybe it hangs like a heavy load, or then it explodes. The explosion that we're seeing on the streets is a direct function of the oppression that people have swallowed, not only for 400 years, we don't have to go back that far. Every time a Black person, man or woman, and 20% of these police murders are women. So a lot of folks want to say Black men, but 20% of these are women. Anytime someone is killed, it takes a bite out of one of our hearts and one of our lives. Every time somebody is killed, we want to know why, and we never get answers. Every time someone is killed, what ends up happening is there are excuses. Well, they were afraid for their life. If you are Black and woke, you've been afraid for your life all your life.
Earth.
Because this is what happens to us. So I think it's really important to claim a couple of things. One, I don't really want to talk about women of a color. I want to talk about Black women.
Yeah.
I want to talk about Black women. We should be unapologetically Black. Now, we do live in a space that is common, but we need to be unapologetically. Number two, I want to talk about the ways that the oppression of Black men, who we tend to focus on, also splashes back to Black women. We are the ones, there's what I call is a triple threat. You know, we have race, gender, and the oppression of our men as something that we have in our portfolio. So when you look at Black men being incarcerated, who's visiting them? Like, who have less wages, less mobility. So I think we need to deal with that. And you've seen the mothers in these post-shooting incidents crying their hearts out. We need federal legislation that says if a police officer chooses to kill somebody, he also needs to be treated just like ordinary citizen would be.
That's right.
This COVID thing, the collision of COVID and police brutality is challenging because I saw so many of our young people out there not observing the 6 feet, the social distancing, but at the same time, I really wish I was out there with them.
Yeah.
Because, but I'm too old and I have underlying conditions. So, but in any case, what they're doing is they're lifting it up in the same ways that people did in 68 and 92 and now. Black folks are saying, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. And the issue is for us to develop public policy that responds to that.
So let's transition into that discussion. We've done a good job of laying out sort of the really challenging economic framework and health framework facing Black people, Black women. Let's talk about what we should be doing together to try to fight for and win some solutions that would change some of the structures. And so I'm going to open it up for people to say, what are the policies? If you could wave a magic wand and implement a set of policies, tomorrow, what do you think would be most impactful in terms of changing the world that we're living in right now?
I'll say one of the main ones that comes up for me always before COVID and now is the issue of everybody having a living wage. And in particular, I talk about Black workers. I talk about the grindingly low wages. I talked earlier about the temporary system that affords no status. We need hardcore legislation that addresses the disparities instead of putting a Band-Aid over it, instead of some people flinching when you mention the issue. You can't believe how many elected officials I've spoken to, I've sent emails to, I've texted them, don't forget to include Black workers in the discussion for hazard pay, in the discussion for paid sick leave, in the discussion for a living wage. And they're reluctant to even raise these issues sometimes because of their fear of not getting a committee or their fear of not being favored by their white counterparts. We need brave leadership. We need people who actually will intentionally and verbally speak to the issues that we've been addressing on this webinar. We know what the policy issues are. The policy of disfavoring and setting aside Black people, that's the policy that this country was built on. What are we going to do to reconstruct that or destruct that and create something new? We need to talk about how people are living. And why are people living the way they're living? They're living the way they're living because they don't have a decent living wage. They don't have human rights on their job. They don't have dignity on the job. How can we address some of those things? Maybe some of the local efforts, some ordinances that talk about dignity at work, some of the state legislative pieces that talk about dignity at work, that talk about the disproportionality of Black women still being at the very, very bottom in terms of wage distribution. Those are the policies we need to see, but we can't get people to get to that because there's a feebleness and a cowardice, I'll say, coming from a lot of the leadership. And I'm saying this, I'm not assigning it to anyone on this webinar, but I know for a fact that there are people who skirted these issues and they've known about these problems that face our communities, in particular, the problems that face Black people. They've known about it. So we need a change in leadership. We need braver leadership. We need young people to step up, or young at heart people. You don't have to be chronologically young, but you do have to have a revolutionary mind if you want to see change. So we can identify people who can stand up in the halls of justice and make some points on behalf of the sufferers. That's going to go a long way. The policy narrative is too weak. It's too pretentious. It's too talking head-ish. We need to see more of the stories coming out during the policy discussions. Bring some of the workers there. Bring a laundry worker from Mississippi who stood in flooded water with plastic bags over her feet. Bring somebody who had to wear a diaper because they didn't have bathroom rights. This is happening now in the 21st century.
And getting back to this.
Sorry, go ahead, Valerie.
Getting back to the issue that came up earlier, a couple issues I think are related. The issue related to data, but also targeting. I think, and this is related also to what Drew just mentioned, I think we have to be real about the fact that we don't have any race neutral policy. Even if we presume that we're going to come up with a policy, like I was saying before, that is a far-reaching, widespread, universal type policy, because of the history of racism in this country and the structures that it has put in place, even that policy is going to play out differently for different people. So it's so important. I think one of the main adjustments or things that we should be doing related to policy is how we make policy and how we use the information that has been available forever with the stories and the narrative to really think through how a policy is going to play out in implementation and how you could actually perpetuate something that you think you're resolving because you're unaware of the underlying circumstances and situations that people face in this country based on where they live, based on who their parents were, et cetera. So I think that's important. And then the other issue, the race-specific policies or laws that we have in place and have for decades, there's a real problem with enforcement there. This again gets to this issue related to power and representation and someone's ability to really stand up and try to enact or to call in the rights that on the books are ours, but in practice, we don't see. And I think that's a lot of what's behind the uprisings that we're seeing in the street. People keep saying, go through the system, follow the system, file this complaint, do this, do that, and nothing happens. But that's because we have things on the books, but the way that they actually play out and actually work in real life, there's very little teeth behind that at all. So I think we really need to change the way that we structure policy and the way that we enforce those laws and policies.
Great, thanks so much, Valerie. Rhonda?
I was going to say,
Rhonda, then Julianne, then Anne.
I'm going to piggyback on what Valerie was saying in terms of the way that we structure policies and what policies look like. And anyone who's heard me knows that I'm very adamant. And yes, Yoruba, I'm going to beat data to death because in so many instances, people want to see the numbers before they hear the narratives. Even if they hear the narratives, they want you to come back to the data. And I often say, if we don't disaggregate the data correctly, you can't craft policies effectively. So one of the things that's really important for me is, and Valerie, you said this earlier when you were talking about families, and it's clear in your report, I'd like to see us rethink what a family is. How often in policy conversations, I'm not a family, right? Because I don't live with someone, I don't have a child, I'm not married. I, as one, I'm not a family, and how often then I'm left out of that conversation. The number of Black women who are single and living alone is larger than any other racial ethnic group. The number of Black women, Black women are also less likely to get married. So when you think about what our household structure is going to look like, the likelihood that we are going to be a household of one, I'd like to see, that definition of a family really address the changes in family structure or all families in the ways that we have shifted policies to think about same-sex households and that they are families. I'd like to be considered a family. And I think that connects very much to what Jaribru has said about living wage. I'm not generally part of that conversation, right? Can I live, do I get a livable wage to make my household as a household of one whole? Right. So that, that's one of the things that two of the things I would say, disaggregate the data so that we're really careful not to overgeneralize. And let's change this definition of family so that households that are single and living alone are also considered families and are part of the policy conversation.
Well, I just want to clarify, I was not trashing or bashing data. It comes from just inside my body, I have a cynicism. Because I've seen so much data, I've seen so many reports that have been paid for by the 501c3 nonprofit complex, industrial complex, and I've not seen a lot where those numbers are used to actually affect change, to even correctly bring the numbers to the seats of power with the faces that are represented in those numbers. So I'm still going to say that by and large, in the bourgeois educational system, the data is often held by those who are privileged to hold it, and it's not dispersed, it's not distributed, it's not really brought back to the community for trainings, for pop ed, for the types of interventions that we need to see. So yes, no, I'm not trashing data, and I'm not trashing those who collect the data. I'm saying that historically, what I've seen as an activist for over 40 years now, I have seen reports, and you can imagine how many I've seen. I'm older than Julianne. You can imagine how many reports I've seen with the numbers right there, and people keep saying, oh, now that I have the numbers. I'm talking about the power brokers. I'm not talking about those who are conscious and raise those numbers up. I'm talking about when they're given to those who could do something, what happens then? That's my only issue with the data, not trash.
I want to say two things. I mean, first of all, we economists live off data. That's what we do. Even though you may have questions about even how it's collected, how it's distributed, that's how we are able to measure things. Now, and I'm not, that's what we do. And I'm open to, I remember when I worked, I'm so old, when I worked at the Council of Economic Advisors back in maybe 76 after Carter was in, they used to report unemployment data as white, non-white. And as they didn't break down, non-white was black and everybody else. Say black. I mean, it was one of my first fights that perhaps contributed to my cantankerous reputation. I'm like, why the F y'all don't say black? And that's just how it was. So people have avoided the data because the data tells a story. And so even as you maybe disparage the data or talk ugly about it, the fact is that it's a first step for us. It's not the last step for us, but it's the first step for us. It gives us an opportunity to measure. Now, the second thing I want to say in terms of data and in terms of where we are with this conversation, I think that Valerie talked about race neutrality. Somebody did. There is no such thing. Right. And so I think that anytime public policy is implemented or even suggested, we need to talk about a race audit, because many people say race neutrality, this doesn't affect Black people. Yeah, it does. I mean, when you give people who have a lot of money another tax break and Black folks don't have a lot of money, that essentially has a racial impact. So one of the things from a policy perspective, if we're serious about wealth gaps and reparations and all that, then we need any policy that you implement or you think about implementing has to have something like a racial audit. I've talked to Congresswoman Waters about this a time, about how this might happen, but we know where we live. We live in a place where the orange man basically does not understand race. And when he does, he has something ugly to say, looting and shooting.
He understands it real well.
That's a very
looting and shooting. Looting and shooting, for the record, He been looting this country ever since he's been in. I suggest that anybody shoot me. I'm just saying. But in any case, I think that there are ways that we can use metrics to talk about where we're going. And I think a race audit is one of the ways to do it.
Thank you for that
if I
policy suggestion. Hang on one second, Jaribu. I'm going to go to Anne,
Okay.
and then we need to move into some of the questions that have come in through our chat. So Anne.
Yeah, I just want to make a couple of quick points. One about the infrastructure in which we live in for those of us who are in this nonprofit industrial complex. And so I think it's very challenging. Right now, everyone's putting forward solutions, and I'm not saying there are not some good ones out there. There were good ones before COVID, and ones that we need to elevate now. But we don't have the right investment infrastructure to deal with what we're confronted with right now, right? We don't have an infrastructure that says, hey, all 4 organizations can come together to build up a platform and work across communities to actually move our work. Our work is siloed. Our work is it's a very individual and almost competitive kind of nature, which is counter to what we need right now. So let's talk about, the fact that people have been putting forward great policies for years and that we don't have an investment infrastructure to actually handle the moment that we're in. If we sat around, the 6 of us, we could actually build something really amazing in thinking about policy. There's a number of us working across the country that if we were given the room and the investment could take our work much further. So we need a better infrastructure. The second point I want to make is that we need to stop looking for silver bullets. I mean, this is a long haul. We're in this for the long haul. We can see these intersections, and we need to work at the intersection of issues in a much deeper ways than what we're doing, and not be lulled into this silver bullet, let's, easy fix kind of dialogue. And then just the final point I will make is that we can't lose sight of the work that's been taking place in lieu of a lot of lack of movement in federal policy on the local and state level, where we've made probably the most progress on racial inequities, right? And we're now confronted with a situation, if we do not see localities get more money, that we're going to see a retrenchment in the work that we've done. We're going to see a rolling back and perhaps even greater extraction of resources. And so this local work is extremely important going forward. We need to think about those folks who are working in places where there's preemption, where they don't have the luxury of being able to put forward great local policies, where they're working on the edges of policy, where that movement is very difficult. So we'd have to think about this in a range of ways, but we can really do this better if we could work at these intersections. So just want to make that point.
Thank you so much, Anne. And I want to piggyback on what you started to open up, and that's a question of what we can do at the state and local level to make change, given that the federal government is so deadlocked right now. And so one of the questions that came in from a participant in advance of the webinar is that they're interested in hearing what policy changes at the state level will best promote racial equity when it comes to jobs, and how to build the power to demand those changes.
Yeah, let me just mention one. I know others want to jump in. Just one very quickly.
Yeah.
I think that when we think about the role that criminal fines and fees have played, the role that mass incarceration has played, and how intersectional that is, how that limits people's opportunities for work, how it diminishes the earnings that they can realize, how it takes resources out of families, extracts resources with families helping one another. So where we've seen a lot of progress in places that are really trying to look at these criminal fees, that they're unjust, they're on the backs of Black and brown people, is one way we can think about looking at this. And we have to really think that some of this happened after the Great Recession as a way to build up budgets that were crunched by, and it could easily happen again. So that's one area I just wanted to say real quickly.
Thank you so much, Anne. Jaribu?
Yeah, I just wanted to, in response to the question about local, particularly state remedies, we were one of the states where we experienced the preemption. There were some progressive local municipality measures that were proposed and actually put in place, and they were shot down through the vicious, mean-spirited state apparatus that we have here. So it can't just be left up to the state structures and government structures. People have to be armed with the information. And that's why I think it's so important to democratize the distribution of data so people are armed with the information. And we do a different type of organizing where people go into these structures and confront the leaders who are keeping. They voted no on paid sick leave in a state that's 50 at the bottom, number 50 in poverty. The legislature voted no on paid sick leave. And within that group of people voting no, because we're not in the majority, there were 5 of us who misguidedly voted with them against paid sick leave. So the issue for me is popular education, always arming people with what they need so they can take control of it themselves. But we are in that preemption posture where everything that's progressive, everything that's people-centered that tries to get out is stopped at the gate once we get to the State House. So, yeah.
And thank you for flagging preemption. I will say, you know, it is one of the ways that sort of Southern right-wing policymakers in particular it's a tool that they're using to really prevent localities from being able to pass these kinds of policies. It would lift up Black and Brown communities. And so I just wanted to highlight, we're actually working on a report on how preemption, how states interfering in the ability of city councils and county commissions to pass laws that would benefit their folks. We're working on a report that details that and what the economic cost to Black and Brown workers and communities are. So just want to flag that. Okay, Jhumpa, did you want to get in there?
Yeah, I just think that we cannot have a conversation about what policies need to get passed without talking about policies about policing, right? Especially in this moment. And
Jhumpa, can you just say that again? I don't know if I was the only person that heard.
Oh, sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah, better.
Okay, I was saying that I cannot let a conversation about policy changes go by without having a conversation about policing, right? Particularly today, right now. So I think one of the things that can happen at the local level is really understanding that the policing system is just not something that we can reform or fix anymore, right? Like there has been so much written, you know, look at the 1619 Project, thousands of documentaries, books, right, that talk about how policing in its current state comes from slave patrols, right? So the anti-Blackness that is baked into policing cannot be reformed. It simply cannot be. We need to be looking at alternatives to policing, right? And that can happen at the local level. And there are tons of grassroots movements that are looking to defund police, divest from police, and invest in community infrastructure, right? Which will actually help all of our communities. So that is a policy. It's not one policy, it's a bunch of different policies that's looking at policing and divesting. And really having conversation around what does safety and justice look like and mean when we center Black people. And again, when we center Black people, I do believe it's particularly centering Black women, we will be uplifting everyone, right? So I think the nation is ready to have a conversation around alternatives to policing. And it's not just reform. We've tried reform. It's not working, right? Like how many times are we going to have this conversation over and over again? And it pains me. It's emotional for me, as it is, I'm sure, for all of you, right? But what is it? The definition of crazy is doing the same things over and over again and expecting a different outcome. That's what we're doing right now. And we have to be bolder, and we have to talk about root causes, and we have to be open to thinking outside of our boxes.
Great, thank you. Another question that came in over the chat is a provocative one about the role of philanthropy. And the question is, can the speaker share a bit more about the role of philanthropy and funders in rebuilding without perpetuating old systems of racial oppression? What can funders do differently? Where should they direct funds besides all of the groups that are speaking on this call today? How should they talk about racial equity, inequity, and anti-Blackness? Who do they need to partner with to do this work authentically? So now's your opportunity to talk to funders.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
so I want
Anne?
to ask Anne, if you would share, I think, with the audience, the comments that you made at the conference in Las Vegas, which really struck me, right? It's when you have an innovative idea, when you do want to center on Blackness, or it's not something that folks see as being something that they can replicate, or they don't quite understand the value, because sometimes you also need to understand funders about anti-Blackness policies, right? And then having a board that's going to let you just move forward and do stuff even when you don't have funders. It really hit me when you talked about that in Las Vegas.
Yeah, just really quickly, I think that it's important to understand what I talked about, what Rhonda's referring to, is the fact that it's very difficult for Black leaders, particularly Black women, to put forward ideas that are innovative, because they have to first be verified and codified by others, and particularly mainstream white organizations, before they're seen as valid, right? And once those ideas have really flipped out of their hands, and now someone else is reaping the benefit because they have power, right? And so what is seen as taking a risk and being innovative often doesn't comport with being a Black woman. And so that really has to change, to think about the ideas that Black women are bringing. Look, let's just say it like it is. The National Welfare Rights Organization in the 60s said we need a new economic order. They said we have to stop seeing Black women as workers and see them as full people. And they put forward a guaranteed minimum income. That, discussion that we're having today was predicated on the work of Black women largely and other women of color, right? So these ideas that we may have often don't come into play. It takes a very long time if it comes about at all. So that's one thing. The other is, I think it's so important right now to invest in structural change, right? This is a long-term work. How many grants can we get that says you've got 2 years to solve this race problem? Sometimes 1 year, right? There's not a long-term investment. There's not a sense that this is a marathon, right? And so there has to be a now, working on the issue of wealth, where I've seen tens of millions of dollars put into work that's about individual behavior, that's about, hey, can someone open a bank account? It's not dealing with the underlying structures that we're talking about today, and it makes that work so scrappy and so difficult to move. So deeper structural work, trust Black women, trust that leadership, and know that the way that the structures that are in place are really based on power. They're based a lot on white power, right? Who has those relationships? Whose voices get heard? And what's happening right now? Everyone's scurrying to put out 9,000 reports to make sure their voice is heard. And why? Because they know that's about money, right? Meanwhile, while we could be having deep conversations and relationship building to do the work that's going to be required of us, our energy is zapped because that's what we're doing now, because that's what we have to do to get the little bit of money that we need to do what we want to do, right? So I think there's a deep structural problem, and foundations have to take a look in the mirror and say, what have we done to contribute to these inequities? What have we done, not to just say that we're propping up Black women leadership, because a lot of that is rhetoric. What are we actually doing? How do our dollars get spent? How long are our funding cycles? How do we really help people partner? So those are things I think could take us further.
And I just want
Thank you so much.
to offer a slightly different
Hang on
perspective.
1 second. We got two people talking at once. Okay, Julianne, I heard first, and then Jaribu.
I was actually, okay.
Wait,
what I wanted to say, as Ann talked about foundations and grants and philanthropy, is that understand where these people's money came from. That's the first thing you need to do. Understand where people's money came from. So they are predatory capitalists, and their job is to hold up predatory capitalism. Now, I'm a member of the board of EPI, and we go wherever to try to get money. And I'm not dissing anybody about this, but I'm just saying, let's be clear. Foundations are not going to upset the apple cart. They're not going to change the ways that we do things. And so we need to be clear about that. If you talk about racial economic justice, do you expect to get that from the Ford Foundation? I mean, really, y'all, just thinking about what exactly can be done. So while philanthropy has a role, and there, you know, my baby sister is on some, she works for the Casey Family Foundation, and blah, 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 blah. There's some good people involved in philanthropy, but philanthropy's job has never been to change the social structure. So we should not expect that from them.
Right.
You get a penny here, a quarter there, you know, a 2-year grant or a 3-year grant. But the ways that we change the economic structure is really to dismantle it. And that's why I've been solidarity with them folks in the streets. Now, I wish they would put stuff on fire, but I've been solidarity with them because they're sort of saying, let's upend this spit. I didn't curse. Let's just upend this spit. And that's what these, so philanthropy can do a little, but it won't do a lot when you look at the origins, number one, the board structure, number two, the revolutionary interest, number three, and the ways that they're committed to changing the structure, number four. That's all.
Thank you, Jaribu.
Yeah, I much of what I was going to say, Julianne already said it, so I'm not going to be redundant, but I will say this. I was a Soros Justice Fellow, and there was a workshop where Stephen Hawkins came in and he did a presentation, and he said, if 75% of your resources come from philanthropic grants, then you are in deep trouble and you're not going to be able to really be effective. And it's true. So we need alternative resources, and we need to also study history about how movement building was done under people like Fannie Lou Hamer, who never had any grants at all. But now when we touch the screen and vote, we have to think about her and the role she played in getting us there. Many, many revolutionary acts and revolutionary reforms that were done from not just from the 60s, but certainly that's a period to lift up where there was no 501c3 money. And we were the victims of retaliation because when we went to Durban, South Africa, and we spoke up at the World Conference Against Racism about the racism of the United States government, how it was founded, how it was established, and its failure to meaningfully participate in that international conference, we were defunded left and right and told it was because of the Durban conference. So if you are saying things that lead to a discussion around dismantling, you got to accept the fact that you're going to lose resources from the very structures that prop up those systems. And you got to have alternative resources, not pipeline, but you got to have alternative resources, donor bases with the grassroots people that you work with, passing the hat at a meeting, making sure that people invest in the work by donating something, even if it's something small, to develop a different culture of self-determination about how are we going to survive to do this work. We're still here. The lights are still on. Well, I'm in my house right now. The lights are still on, and we can still take a phone call, even though we've been defunded by most philanthropic organizations. So how do we survive without the funding when it vanishes from our portfolios? How do we survive? We have to already have in place alternative solutions so that philanthropic donations is only part of our strategy for resource grabbing and not the whole strategy.
Thank you
Naomi,
for that, Rhonda.
I'm going to be really swift, and that is in terms of thinking about innovation and partnering. I would really like to see more partnering as we're doing here, not just in terms of webinars, but indeed on projects. And I think one of the things that we tend not to do is we view a lot of things as a zero-sum game. We don't think that when we have a connection in a philanthropic area to ask ourselves, who else is doing work that they should be supporting? Right? And we're not sending out those emails, and we're not making those connections because often we're concerned about what it means for us. Again, for me, I started this as without resources, my own resources, and I hope my mother is still on the line, with a great deal of support from my mom and my stepdad, right? Both in terms of allowing me to live with them, and my mother providing support every month for rent. Right. But because, as Valerie was talking about earlier in terms of this wealth gap, I went back to my 401k, right? I utilized my resources to do this because I didn't have those connections. And in many instances, I still don't have those connections. So I think when we're talking about being innovative, and I saw a paper come out by Sandy Darity and one of his students, and it came back to this notion again of wealth, that wealth not only protects us in moments of COVID, but wealth also allows us to be risk takers. Right? It provides that support for us to be innovative in the way that I have been with the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, Race, because I saw reports that didn't talk about me. When they said women, they meant white women, and I was between the commas for a deficit perspective, right? Right? If you don't have that, if we're not connecting with each other outside of this space, we also can't help foundations make changes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Rhonda. And so as we close, we've got 5 minutes left, and I want to offer up one sentence to each of the panelists to offer up what you think, what you really hope the audience is coming away from this conversation with, or a recommendation for folks on this call to take action. There were a lot of questions that came through about what can we be doing to support workers organizing, what can we be doing to be helping in this moment. So either one thing you want folks to take away, or one thing you want folks to actively do when they leave this conversation.
I'll start. I guess we can go around the screen. Yeah. I think for me, one of the things I like to see folks actively pushing for and holding people accountable about is really disaggregating data. I mentioned this with respect to COVID, that we do not know exactly who's dying, right? The data suggests that men are disproportionately impacted, but we are not seeing the numbers come out to tell us what's happening in the US with respect to men. I think maybe Alabama, one of these southern states actually is disaggregating the data to tell you by comorbidity how it's been impacting folks. Senator Warren and Presley have pushed, make this comment about disaggregating data, but I don't think that we have an understanding in this moment with COVID, how very important it is not for people to give us data by race, not to give it to us by gender, not to give it to us by age, but we need the intersection of those so that we really have a clear view of who's dying and where they're dying.
Great, thank you. And so I'm going to limit everybody else to one sentence. I'm so sorry. One sentence. What do you want folks to take away? We've got in the 3 minutes we have left.
Okay, I guess I'll go next.
Okay, and then Valerie, Julian, Jaribu, and Jhumpa. Okay, Anne.
Courage enough to say Black, as Jaribu said. To take up anti-Blackness, to center Black women, and to work together with or without resources.
Love it. I forgot the order I just said, so I'm going to Valerie.
I probably would use one word and building off what Ann just said, and that's remember. We have these outbursts, violent incidents and things that happen, and people get in an uproar about it for a couple weeks and then it's done. We have to remember, this isn't new. We have to remember.
Thank you. Julian. Oh, you're on mute. Well, yeah.
Okay,
Julian.
can you hear me now? Okay,
Yeah.
I would just say simply vote. It's really important for us to participate in the electoral process. We've been talking about economic issues, but economic issues flow out of political issues. So I would say number one, vote. And number two, what Rhonda said is extremely important. We have to have the data disaggregated. We don't even know who got the PPP money. We don't know how many Black people, how many Black businesses were sidelined. So we must make sure that we get disaggregated data. And that's only going to happen. We have responsible people in public policy, which means vote, 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 vote.
Great, thank you. Jaribu.
Okay, push for revolution, political alternatives that call for removal when people are in office that hurt us, and always turn toward a new system, a system that doesn't represent exploitation.
Thank you. And Jumpa.
Sure. Black people are not a monolith, right? So Black people are immigrants, Black people are undocumented, Black people are transgender, Black people are lesbian, gay, all the things, right? So when we center Black people, and Black women in particular, we are actually talking about all of us.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so we're wrapping up. We heard, it was a very robust conversation. Thank you to our amazing panelists. We could have done a full day conference about this, and maybe we'll do that at some point when the world changes. But if you're interested in continuing to have this kind of conversation, there's going to be a form that shows up. I think it's when you leave the meeting that will ask you to opt in if you want to be tapped into for future conversations on this. We heard a lot of important themes today about centering Black workers, centering Black women, really focusing on the essential workers and not viewing them as expendable in this moment, the importance of worker power and the importance of all of us working together in this moment. And so, I just want to leave you with, as we've been talking about today, this is an incredibly difficult time for all of us. I hope that each of us here really double down on a commitment to fighting racism and fighting anti-Blackness. And I also hope that each of you take care of yourself and your loved ones during this time. Deep trauma is inflicted every single time we watch or hear about or think about the brutal looting of Black people. And so please take care of yourselves, and thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for moderating.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. And we will be sending out the recording and links to the report that Valerie has done, as well as the links to all of the organizations represented here on the call today. So thank you so much. Bye all.
Bye.
Bye.
Ciao.